You now know how to work with the controls needed to create almost any online form. One thing you'll often want to do with online forms is to validate the user's input to make sure that they are entering everything correctly. Although you could validate input using a combination of C# and JavaScript, ASP.NET provides a series of controls that will automatically generate the validation code for you. The required field validator is one of these controls. To begin, open the Shining Stone sample file from your Sample Files folder. And open buy.aspx in Design View. This is the form that a visitor to the site would use to buy a product. It isn't finished yet, and one thing it needs is validation. We are now going to add a required field validator control to the page. You'll find it under the Validation category in the toolbox. Place the control just after the text box following Address 1. A required field validator simply makes sure that the user has entered something into the control it validates. In this case, you're going to make it validate that text has been entered into the TextBox Address 1 control. We are now going to set the properties of the new required field validator. Set the ID property to Required Field Validator Address 1. Set the text property to a single asterisk. This is the message that will appear if the control fails to validate, that is, if the user doesn't fill in the field. Next, set the Control to Validate property to TextBox Address 1. The Control to Validate property tells the validator which control it is going to check. At this point, also note the Validation Group property. You already know that an ASP.NET page is implemented using one and only one form that typically includes all page content. This can cause a problem. Imagine that you had a login section at the top of this page containing username and password fields. When the user tried to log in, validation would fail because Address 1 is blank. Validation groups solve this problem. All validation controls have the Validation Group property, which is blank by default. This means that, by default, all controls belong to the same validation group. If you wish to associate some form controls with a Submit button, in this example the username and password, you would set the Validation Group property of these controls to the same value. When the user clicked the Submit button, validation rules would then only be applied to the username and password. We're now going to see the required field validator in action, so view the page in your browser. And try clicking the Submit Order button without entering anything into the text boxes. As you can see, the page doesn't post back, and your asterisk text appears where you placed your required field validator control. Now try typing something into the Address 1 text box. Click Submit Order again, and this time the page posts back without any problems. Close the web browser now. Although the messages you've seen displayed so far are very fast and helpful, the web server implements them using JavaScript. A malicious user could bypass your validation by simply disabling JavaScript. Fortunately, you can use C# to very easily check that the user hasn't somehow bypassed your validation rules. To do this, open the code behind file of by.aspx and add the following code to the button submit order click event handler. If begin brackets page.isValid end brackets response.write OK. This will recheck the user input against all validators on the page, and only write OK if all validation rules succeed. This is a very useful security enhancement. Note that this code uses an if statement. You'll learn all about them in Lesson 7.1. View the page in your browser again. Enter some text into the Address 1 text box and click Submit Order. As you can see, the page submits and the C# test succeeds. If you disabled JavaScript to try to bypass the validation, the C# test wouldn't succeed and you wouldn't see OK. Close your browser and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 4.8. Use the required field validator control.